You're listening to episode 323 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Zen teacher and author Brad Warner joins us to talk about his new book, Short Intro Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen. Hi, everyone. I want to thank those of you for supporting the Secular Buddhist Association with your generous contributions. Because of that dana, we're able to continue offering this podcast, the discussions on our website, secularbuddhism.org, and of course, our live online practice circle. And if you haven't yet, you're welcome to visit the website and show your appreciation, as we appreciate you listening in and sharing your own voice in this exploration of the Dhamma in our lives. Many of you listening to this podcast may identify as Buddhists of one kind or another, Zen, Theravada, secular, or other branches of the Buddhist tree, but you may not be in a predominantly Buddhist culture. How do you have those conversations about your practice if you're not heritage Buddhists with those who don't know about it? Many of us have also lost someone dear and never had that talk. Through old age, illness, or accident, those we love and we ourselves will pass on. Today's guest reflects on what it's like to share his practice with those who are no longer with us. While playing hardcore punk in the early 80s, Brad Warner became involved in Zen Buddhism. He made it to Japan in 1993, where he began studying the philosophy with an iconoclastic rebel Zen master named Gudo Nishijima. After a few years, Nishijima decided to make Brad his successor and teacher of Zen. In addition to several books, he's published work in the Buddhist magazines Shambhala Sun, Buddha Dharma, and Tricycle, as well as rock magazines such as Alternative Press, Maximum Rock and Roll, and Razor Cake. So sit back, relax, and have a nice peppermint tea. Our guest today is Brad Warner. Brad, welcome back. Nice to see you again.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
So your new book, and I do want to make a special mention, Kim Corbin has been fantastic in helping coordinate these interviews and just over the years. So shout out to Kim. Thank you so much for that. Your new book, Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen. It's a little different than previous ones. Why don't you tell us about the format? And listeners may have gathered just a little bit of that from the title.
Yeah. Well, the title is it's one of these examples of, that keeps happening to me, of a working title that became the actual title, because it's just a description. Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen is like this package contains pancakes or something, it doesn't really, it's very, right out there. But it's a series of letters written to a friend who died. The story is that in the year 2014, I was traveling through Europe doing a tour it's something I've done for now. This year was my 10th year of doing this. And I just go to different places and lecture about Zen and run retreats and so forth for a month or so and then come back home. So in 2014, a friend of mine who I'd known since high school was dying of cancer, and as I was doing this, and I had gone to visit him 2 times during his illness, and the last time I'd seen him was a couple months, maybe a month even, before the tour started. I'd been in contact with him throughout the tour via email and social media and things. And then at one point during the tour, the emails, he stopped replying to the emails. And I ended up hearing that he died when I arrived in Hamburg, I think, in Germany, and just I'd gone through a long car ride from Bonn, and I opened my computer up when I got in because I wanted to see what had happened. And I got an email from a friend of his saying he died. So I just kind of wandered the streets of Hamburg, and I found this pizza shop and sat in this pizza shop. And I have a diary that I keep when I go on these tours. And I just wrote a bunch of things in the diary that was sort of like a letter to my friend. I wasn't intended that way, but it just sort of came out that way. Like, God, I miss you, and I wish I'd said this and that. And, it kind of went on for a few pages like that. So that was in 2014. I did a couple of books in the interim, Don't Be a Jerk and It Came from Beyond Zen. And then I was going to do another book, but I didn't want to do another one of these Dogen books. I wanted to do something that was more related to the basics of Zen philosophy. Because even though I thought the Dogen books were pretty much geared towards the general audience, I was hearing from people like, oh, this, they were getting kind of scared off by the subject matter. And I wanted to do something more basic. So I sold my publisher's New World Library on the idea of doing this thing that was tentatively called Zen 101. And as I was writing Zen 101, I was just getting bored out of my skull. Like it's another, the 4 Noble Truths, the 10 Precepts, and then, all this stuff. And I just didn't care about it. So looking for some inspiration, I leafed through a bunch of these old diaries that I kept while I was traveling through Europe, thinking, well, maybe there's something in here that'll, spark something in my mind to get this book done. And I looked at that letter, and that letter, well, it wasn't a letter, it was a diary entry, but it said some of the things that I kind of wanted to say in the book about Zen and what it had meant to me, and how I felt like I had never adequately explained this to some of my closest friends and family and things. And so I decided to just write the whole book as a series of letters. So it's a slightly literary conceit. I mean, I assume everybody, I don't know if everybody reading knows they aren't really letters written to a dead friend, but it's a literary conceit to write them as letters. But when I decided to do this, I decided to just go all the way with it, which means I wrote them exactly as I would have written them if this friend of mine could have read them. I didn't try to leave anything out or put anything in or anything like that, or change them in any way. I didn't want to be phony about it. I really kept this person in mind the entire time that I was writing, to make it seem more authentic. And then I had to kind of go back after I'd done that, realizing that there's a lot of stuff an ordinary general reader isn't going to understand if it just comes out raw like that. So, adding a few explanatory things in here and there. But it's all, it all really happened, and all the tour stuff really happened. The one sort of fictional thing is I added some things from different tours in there. But any event that I describe in the book is happening to me while I was touring Europe. All of them are real. So all that crazy, weird stuff in there, the narrative stuff is all true too. So that's what the book
some of
is.
the interesting stuff about reading the book is the kinds of things that a Zen teacher runs into as they're traveling around doing this stuff. And the way
at least that I run into.
that you run into anyway. Yeah. And as these are descriptions in the letter format, it's still very touching, because you're also including these personal feelings and thoughts and humor, dark humor that runs into about talking to someone who's gone and what that's like. And that was really riveting and interesting, and made it actually a bit more of a page turner than I found in the books. I really enjoyed that part. So along with that, you had mentioned that it's not stuff you've really talked about with your friends and family,
Mm,
the Zen thing. You didn't talk much about your practice with old friends.
yeah.
Have you thought about why not? What was it that kind of kept that separate?
Well, in the case of, I didn't use the person's real name, but in the case of the Marky in the book, a person I call Marky in the book, it just, well, especially when he was dying, when he knew he'd had a diagnosis and from the beginning, they caught the cancer very late. So it was a bad prognosis right from the first day he heard it. So he knew he was going to die from this thing. And spending time with him, I thought, well, if I'm dying, I don't want somebody coming in, especially somebody I've known for a long time, trying to sell me their religion, um, as I'm dying. So I thought, I'm not going to be that guy. I'm just going to be his friend. The conversation needs to go wherever, he wants it to go, because it's his time. If there's ever any time that's not mine, that belongs to somebody else, it's that kind of a situation that makes it, that much more. But he, in general, though, I started doing this Zen practice when I was like 18 or 19 years old. I was a university student, and I was searching for the meaning of life, and there's a whole lot of stuff behind that. But I didn't have this idea that I wanted to be known as the Zen guy. A lot of people get into practices like Zen or any kind of meditation practice because they kind of want to add it to their persona. And there's a lot of people who will. I run into these people sometimes too who don't know what I do for a living and start telling me, well, I'm really into meditation, and I don't usually try to one up them or anything. I'll just listen. And really into meditation means they've thought a lot about meditating, or they have a Buddha on their front lawn or something like that. And I didn't want to be one of those guys. This was really important to me, and it was really personal to me. So I didn't talk about it. It was really putting out Hardcore Zen in 2004 that kind of outed me to everybody I knew. I mean, there were a few people who already knew what I did, but I think even the ones who knew what I did probably didn't know how deeply I'd gotten into it until that book came out. And then, after that, I just kind of let people ask what they want to ask. And most of my older friends don't ask me about Zen. So, we don't talk about it.
Yeah, well, you get to be you, and
Yeah.
the thing that is added on. You're not putting on robes of identity. It's just you.
Yeah, and that's important, because if you do what I do for a living, there is a certain amount of, you need that personal space of people who aren't going to talk to you about Zen.
Right.
So I spend enough time talking to people about Zen and spirituality and meditation and stuff that there are times when I'm just like, no.
Yeah. So the format is letters to Marky, and I'm wondering if that was helpful to you in writing more of an introductory text than your previous works have been.
Oh yeah, it was really helpful. It gave a life to the thing, because now, instead of, when I was writing this book as Zen 101, it was sort of textbooky, and you don't know who you're writing to if you're writing a textbook sort of thing. And writing it to somebody specific, even though he's no longer with us, gave the whole thing a focus. Like I now not only have to explain what the Four Noble Truths are, I have to explain why the hell I even care what the Four Noble Truths are.
Yeah.
And it forces me to explain it to a person who probably had no real interest in it. My friend actually probably would have been interested in this stuff, but it's one of those things where he never had quite the in. And I think there's a lot of people like that. There are people who have questions and wonder about this. I hate the word spirituality, but I'll use it. So they wonder about the spiritual life and meditative practice and all of that. But it's usually presented as this kind of airy fairy thing that's up in the sky, or a very academic thing that's impossible to understand. So just saying, well, no, this is something just an ordinary person who has no particular holiness or no particularly great intellectual abilities can do. That's something that my teachers kind of presented to me, and I wanted to find a way to present that to the greater world, the population of people who read books with weird covers.
So as you're putting this together, were there some things that you planned to put in, or maybe there were some unexpected, got to have this about Zen for those who didn't know about it?
God, no, I guess I was just trying to think of what a person who doesn't know anything about Zen would need to know or would like to know about it. Like, why would somebody even do such a crazy thing as sit and stare at a wall for an hour a day and, several hours a day on retreat? Some of the sort of philosophical stuff I wanted to get into, and the idea of there not being any real doctrines, which I think has been important, because most people expect a religion to have doctrines. They'll have things, here's what you must believe.
Yeah.
And Zen doesn't have that. You can believe whatever you want. You just do this practice and work on it. But there's some common philosophical things that usually come up around it. And things like describing the koans and stuff. So, yeah, it was sort of, it was kind of proceeded in a haphazard fashion. I didn't really outline it. I just kind of finished one letter and then thought, well, what comes next after this, And I don't even think I reordered them. I think I wrote them pretty much in the order that they're presented in the book, which is, I didn't even think about that until we started having this conversation, because I don't usually do that. I usually write bits and pieces, and then after I've gotten enough material, I kind of assemble it into something. That's my little writer trick for anybody who cares about that sort of stuff. But this one kind of proceeded from start to finish in one single piece.
So as you were going through that and maybe recalling some times with Marky, and you recount some of those events in the book, are there ones that, looking back on it, that were very special and meaningful to you, just on your history with a friend that you're talking about this stuff with?
Well, it's hard to say. There's a lot. Going up to visit him twice during his illness. I did that because it seemed like he wanted me to come up, and I thought, well, he knows what I do. I don't know why he wants me to come up here, really. I mean, I wanted to do it anyway, but we hadn't seen each other that much in person. We'd mostly been communicating through electronic means since, I moved to Japan and he stayed in Ohio, and we kind of drifted that way, although we kept in touch a lot. So coming up to see him in person was, that was a big deal. And I, like I said, I didn't really have an agenda, and I didn't really want to burden him with any sort of agenda. And I do think probably I communicated a bit more than I thought, but it wasn't quite so direct, just kind of being there. So yeah, that stood out. And of course, a lot of things that happen in the book happened separately. One thing that definitely did happen, and it's in the book and it happened during the time, was traveling around with all this on my mind. I got really sick, and this is not the first time I got sick in Europe, but this is something one doesn't want to do when one has a big traveling schedule ahead. And so there's some of that in there. God, no, I don't know what specific things.
So let's shift a little bit. Buddhism, like other religions and practices with long heritages, they're running into kind of a sharp curve with modern, more global society. And I just wanted to hear from you, because you do a lot of traveling, a lot of teaching, about what does that look like for Western Buddhism? What are you seeing happen?
Well,
missing, or what do you want to have happen that's not?
I mean, the biggest thing that's happened since I started is it's just exploded in popularity, which took me by surprise. I started in the early 80s, which would probably be the lowest ebb since Buddhism sort of got introduced in the, you'd say maybe mid 50s to be really generous, but really mid 1960s is when people started getting interested in it in America, really, in terms of really practicing. And so that kind of went on for about, 10 years. And then some scandals happened. And then that, the whole me decade happened, and everybody kind of lost interest in anything spiritual. And so by the early 80s, especially if you were in the punk rock scene like I was, anything about meditation and Eastern spirituality, that was just old hippie garbage. And it was, we're way past that now, and very few people really interested in it. And then I went to Japan, not for Zen reasons, but to get a job. I taught English there for a year, and then I had a job for the rest of the times, the other 10 years I was there, working in a film and television production company. So I would go back to the US once a year, and I went over in 93. So the internet wasn't quite what it is now, in the 90s. In Japan, actually, it was kind of slow to get wired up. Everybody imagines that they would have been the first ones, but they were actually pretty slow. So, I wasn't getting a lot of news, is the bottom line. And just so I go back there and I start seeing just little hints of how this meditation thing is taking off, by watching an episode of The Simpsons, and Lisa is a vegetarian and a Buddhist now, and, and little things like that, and in magazines on the checkout stands at the supermarket, with articles about meditation. And I'm going, oh, geez, this is big now. And that led to a lot of commercialization of it, and people seeing dollar signs where meditation is concerned, and so now you see all sorts of things being advertised, some of them very sincere, some of them completely insincere, some of them scary, to be honest. I've seen some stuff where I'm going, oh boy, I hope nobody goes to that meditation session. And the whole mindfulness craze, which is going on, which is real interesting. A lot of that involves sort of trying to secularize Buddhism, and trying to take a part of Buddhism out of the rest of Buddhism and present it as its own thing, which I do understand the rationale behind that and why people want to do that. But the problem I see with that is you're giving up a lot of the things that were developed over time to bolster the practice of meditation, and to kind of prop it up and to give people, ways to understand it, by denuding it of anything that seems even vaguely religious. You kind of give up that stuff. And I don't know, it's gotten big enough that scandalized Zen teachers are making the news, which surprised me. Like, when Joshu Sasaki's group had all those problems, I think it was in the New York Times and stuff. I'm going, geez, the New York Times, what do they care about this Zen group? But I guess, this thing is big enough that they notice it, which is sort of bizarre,
Well, and that's actually one of the things I wanted to chat about, and kind of keying off that idea that, because I'm involved in these conversations of, mindfulness and Buddhism, and these being, kind of different territories serving different needs, and we'll see where it goes. And I also see hey, that's really good, and that maybe not so much. And how do we help people discern one from the other? And in Buddhism, there are a lot of schisms that have been coming up, that there seem to be some pretty big fails in keeping the precepts or bodhisattva vows.
Yeah.
And some of the things, and we talked about this a little bit before we started recording tonight, I've been sitting with this and kind of wondering, what's wrong? What's the problem? Is it something that this is new, or is this only now it's just coming to light because our society is like opening up the doors to, no, if this is going on, you can say something and people will hear you. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's a lot of factors are going on. You're introducing it to a whole new culture, and I'm reluctant to sort of broadly divide the humans of planet Earth into East and West. But there are some generalities that you can you can kind of pull up into in ways of thinking. And the Western way of thinking has been influenced by a lot of stuff that never happened in Asia. So you got this whole new society getting into it, and also it's modern, and you've got social media, and you've got all these things that didn't exist at the time that a lot of these doctrines, I just said they weren't doctrines, but a lot of these ideas were formulated. I don't know if the schisms and things have been going on since Buddhism started. There's one of the most intriguing ones to anybody who studies Buddhist history is that apparently at the very first council where they were trying to figure out what the Buddha had actually said, a bunch of guys, like half the group, just walked out and said, "This isn't what Buddha said," and they were never heard from again. I guess they were heard from for a little while, but eventually that group sort of faded off, and we don't have any writings from them. So we don't know what they thought Buddha said. It might have been something completely different. So that's been going on right from the start. People just arguing with each other. Who knows about the scandalous stuff? One thing that comes to mind is when I was researching my book, Sex, Sin, and Zen, one of the things that came up was that the word homosexuality didn't exist. Well, it didn't even exist in English until the 19th century. But the only word the Japanese had that meant a homosexual was something like temple boy, which meant a young acolyte at a Buddhist temple who the older monks had their way with. There was a slang term for that, and I've forgotten what it is. But that was replaced by dosei aijin, which is a much more nice term for, it's just a translation of the English word homosexual. But so what I mean to say is, like, even sex scandals or weird things going around that are not new. They're just being kind of taken in a new way. And I should point out that these things shouldn't happen. But whenever you have human beings involved, you're going to have, some people who break the rules, and that's just how it goes. So, unfortunately, that's how we are as a species.
Yeah, it's just that it's struggling with the irony of people who are on the mountain seat teaching about being excellent to each other, and then don't. Yeah,
there is some of that. There have been some famous scandals, but a lot of the scandals that have happened, and this is my own personal take, they tend to happen in centers that have grown too big, and so there's a lot at stake, and you can kind of, if you just kind of look at how a center like that operates, it sort of makes a little bit more sense how these things happen and why they get covered up and stuff. Like, if you have a scandalized teacher who's just kind of teaching out in Walla Walla, Washington or something. I'm just trying to pick a random place.
Deference to Walla Walla. I'm sure you're very place.
Yeah. Just some place that's out and nobody is really paying attention, and he's got 10 students. Well, all the 10 students will probably be disgusted and walk away, and then, it'll just that's what happens. But when you have a large institution where there's a lot of money involved and people are getting paid and people have jobs and careers and things, and then the teacher starts to go bad, well, it's nobody wants to own up to it, because they'll lose their jobs, they'll lose their whole thing that they've got. And so this scandal gets covered up, and then the cover up itself becomes more part of the scandal, and it becomes this huge, massive, horrible thing that makes it into the newspapers and stuff. And
people identify with one of the things I'm seeing in one of the more recent scandals, which will just remain nameless because, oh goodness, that people have a sense of identity with having bought into this teacher.
Yeah, there's that too.
And there's even if they're able to face that the person done wrong, they may still actually be a really good teacher. It's not to say that they don't have another competency, which makes it really tough, because there's but there's also this.
it is really one of the difficult things, because there is that, it people can be really good at espousing a philosophical truth, and they might even have some genuine valuable insight, which is very rare and uncommon. But they can also have another side to their personalities, and things can kind of get weird. God, I mean, there's a whole lot that could be said in here, but it's kind of difficult to parse it all out.
Yeah.
How these things happen. I've actually thought about it a lot, and I can see in my own career, I can see where, oh, this is what happens when you try to mix this thing up with a Western societal thing, because you become famous, and so one of the things that'll happen, I think, is if you've got somebody who's spent a lot of time meditating, which means that they're probably not the most social person in the world. They might be incredibly awkward socially. And because they've really, cloistered themselves off and worked on this project for a long time, and then you kind of shove that person out and say, okay, you're going to teach meditation. And at first it's like, okay, I'm going to teach meditation, but it can, especially in the current contemporary way things go, especially in the United States, you become famous. This person becomes famous, and then becoming famous makes the person attractive in ways that we'll just take a male example here, because it's usually dudes who end up having problems, but in a way that he never was before.
Yeah.
So he's this nerd that nobody paid attention to for the first 40 years of his life, and then he goes out and now he's
Rock star.
He's a rock star. And as good as a person wants to be, there's some things that get very tempting, and we're all prone to fall for those temptations, and it can go out of control very easily. And I think that's a lot of what happens.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is one of the things that comes up for me, and every time this comes up, is people making sure to check in with themselves. Is what's happening here. If someone came to me and said this was happening to them, how would I respond to that? Would that be an okay thing? If someone was doing this to my kid or my sibling or dear friend, like, okay, people need to keep tabs on themselves and keep eyes open, and that can be tough when it may be have a heritage of hierarchical ways of doing things, or even not, if it's even that has been diffused and we're not talking about a strong power differential, if it's still someone who's in that rock star spot.
Yeah, that's a difficult spot to be in. I'm sort of glad that my popularity hasn't really taken off in a big way. I would probably make a better living if I was selling more books, but there'd be a lot more problems, and as it is, I've had some, and I wrote a book prior to this called Zen Wrapped in Karma Dipped in Chocolate, which gets into some of that stuff that happened to me. And sometimes I think, well, if that happened to me at the level of fame that I've got, my God, and I look at some of these spiritual teachers and I'm going, oh man, I don't even have to know that there's, I don't even have to hear any of the specifics. I can just look at it and go, there's definitely some stuff going on there.
Yeah.
And maybe the person's managing it, and which, God bless you if you can manage that stuff, but it can't be easy.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that. Appreciate the conversation on it. And I'm wondering if there's anything else you want to share with the listeners about the book, or maybe any stuff that you're working on now that's coming up.
Oh yeah, there's nothing. I'm doing a podcast now, which is based on the book, because I realized toward the end of writing it that I could keep writing letters indefinitely, and there's a lot more to be said. So I put that into a podcast. So the Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen podcast is I'm writing a new letter to Marky for each episode and reading it in front of an audience. and getting their reaction. And so I've got episode 3. I've got 1 or 2 episodes up already. I think episode 3 just went out to my Patreon supporters because I give it to them first, and it'll be up for the rest of the world. And I should probably do that either tonight or tomorrow. So there's that, and ongoing series of YouTube videos I'm doing, and all sorts of stuff. So I'm not slowing down, keeping going.
Well, welcome to the podcast community, you poor bastard.
Yeah.
Well, our guest today has been Brad Warner, and we're going to have links to some of the stuff we were talking about today, certainly several of his books, but also to that podcast that he mentioned and other information. So, Brad, thanks for being here. Good talking with you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.